Welcome to MassBio's weekly town hall with President and CEO Bob Coughlin. I'm Jennifer Nason, Senior Director of Communications for MassBio, and we're thrilled to have with us today Dr. Nahid Bhadelia, an infectious disease physician and medical director of the Special Pathogens Unit at Boston University School of Medicine. Welcome, Nahid. Welcome, Bob. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Dr. Bhadelia, for joining us, and thank you all of you for tuning in today. We're extremely excited for this week's virtual town hall here at MassBio because we have an amazing doctor joining us a doctor scientist who's going to talk about this virus and what's going on. She's got a front row seat to everything that's happening, and it's going to be an exciting conversation. So thank you all for joining us.
Perfect. And just before we dive in, a bit of housekeeping. As always, we want this to be an interactive discussion. So please use the Q&A tab at the bottom to ask questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. So just diving in with Nahid, could you tell us a little bit about, what the current state of things are? Massachusetts has experienced a major decrease in cases while we've been watching, other states around the country start to see a surge. So can you help us understand what's going on around the country and why some states are just now starting to see that surge in cases?
Thanks so much, Jenny. So what we know is, the further away we go from the beginning of this pandemic, the clock keeps going backwards of where and when this outbreak may have or pandemic may have started. So as you may remember, at the end of January, WHO and the United States Health and Human Services both declared this an international and then a national emergency. The data that we have is that as early as potentially end of January or beginning of February, there was already community transmission of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. And we were in a position, I think, when you look at our own experience here in Boston, I was on clinical service mid-February, and we were seeing patients that clearly had ARDS or this, acute respiratory distress syndrome with no clear explanation for why. And so there may have been circulating disease here in Boston, before we had wide amount of testing as well. You got to a point where I think Massachusetts, in addition to a lot of coastal states, sort of had to put in this very blunt instrument of a lockdown. What the basic concept of all outbreak control is, and I've sort of been part of the outbreak response with Ebola in West Africa. I run a program in Uganda at the border of DRC and in Liberia. And so the general concept in all of the outbreaks that we face is you need to find the people who are sick, you need to find everybody else they've been exposed to, and quarantine them and isolate those who are sick. And by doing that, you're just breaking chains of transmission, right? In February and March, we were not in a position to find everybody who had this disease because we had no ability to test them. And there were so many people that there was no way to sort of capture everybody with that classic way that we do with chains of transmission, contact tracing and testing. That's why lockdowns went into place. Now, the data shows that the introduction on the West Coast was from Asia, at least in Washington. And in New York, you saw both strains of the virus coming from the West Coast as well as from Europe. And so we're probably seeded with a combination of both of those viruses as well. But what happened nationally is that we locked down here on both coasts. We had these major peaks, which are a result of that uncontrolled spread that might have been happening without us detecting it, and started coming off of those peaks because of those lockdowns. The rest of the country, with some exceptions, locked down around the same time. So the coastal states were seeing these multiple introductions of the virus right over this period of time. I think for that introduction, the diversity of that introduction was a lot less for a lot of the states on the mainland than it was on the coast. They locked down around the same time. The goal of the lockdowns, aside from bringing down the number of cases, if you were to drive down the number of cases, right, you let everybody who might have gotten that disease in February and March sort of declare themselves, bring them to care. You stop any new transmissions from happening. You bring the transmission down. The goal was, and one of my colleagues from Duke, Dr. Gavin Yamay, sort of explains it the best. You're putting out this wildfire with the fire extinguisher, and then the goal is you put in fire breakers. You reduce the space between the trees, and so same thing here from a public health perspective. The goal was to set up the testing capacity, to set up the contact tracing capacity, to fix some of the issues that we started seeing on the healthcare worker side or health system side. And so here in Boston, the major things that most hospitals worked on were surge capacity. And that's the surge capacity when it comes to healthcare workers, surge capacity when it comes to space, surge capacity when it comes to physical resources such as personal protective equipment and ventilators and other aspects that are used in care of patients who are critically ill with this disease. The other big thing that we noticed in that setup was supply chain issues. In other outbreaks that I've been part of, you have a supply chain issue, you just ship in more supplies. There's a lag, but you ship in supplies from another area. It's much harder when the whole world is on fire, right? Where everybody's supply chains are affected. And so on the healthcare side, we sort of saw that we saw shortages that we didn't expect to see. For example, anesthetic medications for people who are ventilated. We had enough in stock, we thought, but of course, what one doesn't take into account is New York is also having a large outbreak at the same time. And so all of those things are supposed to be sort of resolved up to the point where we could then open. What happened, though, is a lot of places started opening before having the White House gating criteria in place, which was healthcare capacity, ability to protect the vulnerable in nursing homes and in hospitals and in congregate settings, testing and contact tracing. When we did that, when we started reopening, the states that we're now seeing did not have the capacity when people started mingling again to trace down those chains of transmission. So the biggest outbreaks that we're seeing right now, the greatest sort of impact that we're seeing are in states like Arizona that are still seeing, as of yesterday, it was like 85% inpatient hospital, occupancy and high levels of ICU use. Same thing with the Carolinas, and Texas in particular is seeing just record number of hospitalizations. The situation is, worse in these settings for two reasons. It's not like in the Northeast where we had this peak and we had closed down everything at that point. They're having their own peaks now. But in the middle of a very open society. And so what we know about this disease is that 15% of the people in your disease burden, 15% of people need to be hospitalized. So today, of your disease burden, if 15% of your current disease burden is already overwhelming your health system, just think about the 85% of the people who are in the community who are still transmitting this disease and what the next week or the week after will look like. And so that's sort of the concern that a lot of public health folks have, is that when you see hospitalizations already going up, that's a lagging indicator, which means the disease burden in society, in the communities, is already high. Paired with that is a challenge that in a lot of these states, the physical distancing aspects of it, the best practices, public health practices, are not followed or not mandated. There was a health affairs article last week, for example, that talked about mandates such as the one that we have here in Boston with face coverings. States that put that into place saw whole percentage drops in their case transmissions. We've seen that at the country level as well for modeling data that has been put out. That's not being widely followed in a lot of the states that are being hard hit now. I think Texas finally walked back. Governor Abbott sort of passed a law that said you can't pass a law that says you need to wear a face covering, and they've walked back on that a little bit. Then the last bit, and I'll stop here, my biggest concern in some of these states is their baseline. Outbreaks take on the flavor of the health systems in which they play out. So if an outbreak plays out in Liberia or Sierra Leone, that's a very different outbreak than an outbreak that plays out in Massachusetts, which is a very different outbreak from the one that plays out in Texas. The states that are heavily affected right now, so Texas, Carolinas, again, Georgia, Florida, these are also the states that unfortunately have some of the highest rates of uninsured populations. Texas, I think, was like 18.9 or something like that a couple of years ago. These are also the states that did not take Medicaid expansion. And interestingly enough, these are also the states that have some of the lowest level of public health spending per capita. So just to give you a comparison, here in Massachusetts, we fall into the category of, we spend about $59 to $130 or something per person for public health. In Texas, it's $7 to like $30 something. There's a huge difference in terms of public health expenditure, which makes a huge difference in terms of how much you can rev up the system to respond to a pandemic like this. So that's where we're at now. A lot of states are seeing, as they're opening up, even if their hospitalizations haven't gone up, you are seeing increased rates of cases, and some aspect of that is testing. But what you're also seeing in is the majority of the states, you're also seeing test positivity go up, which means testing is falling behind. We're not testing enough. And so it's 50 different stories. So whichever state you go into, I think it's expanding that and getting a better sense. So I'll stop that. I think that was the broadest question. So I wanted to make sure we put that into place first.
Yeah, you certainly covered
Thank
a
you.
lot
I mean,
there.
it definitely makes us feel lucky to be in Massachusetts. Yeah, Bob, please, do you have anything to add?
Well, no, just, I mean, there's so many different things that we could talk about there. I mean, why were we not ready for PPE? Because we live in a day and age of, you know, just in time inventory, right? That was nobody's fault. It's the way we do business, whether it was the supplies, the availability of medicine and drugs, et cetera. And, you know, one of the things that I'm the most proud of here sitting in the seat at MassBio was that, you know, the life sciences industry responded quickly to work with our partners in the healthcare industry and our partners in government. This isn't a bipartisan thing between Republican or Democrat. I mean, look, we have a Republican administration and they answered the call. We have a life sciences industry that was willing to drop everything and make sure that we donated all of our PPE to the men and women that were working in the front lines in the healthcare industry that needed it. I mean, if we couldn't protect our frontline healthcare providers as they were battling this virus, I mean, that's just unconscionable. So I love now that we're starting to take pause and we got through that peak, and we should talk about if another peak's on the way, because I'm sure there'll be questions from the audience about that. But, you know, some of the things that we're working on now are, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Why do we not have a vaccine for something like this? I mean, we all know how hard drug discovery is, and discovery as it relates to both diagnostics, therapies, and vaccines. I don't think we were prepared in any of the areas for this virus. So what is it that we're going to do moving forward so that this doesn't happen again? There's a lot of lessons to be learned, and folks can rest assured we're learning them.
Absolutely. And I do want to come back to vaccines. But before we do that, we do have a question from the audience. Michael is asking if we will anticipate another surge this fall. You know, given everything you said, is it just going to be kind of ebbing and flowing across the country, or is the fall going to see another surge when at least, you know, the East Coast goes back inside? Nahid, maybe you could take that one.
Yeah. So anyone who tells you with complete absolute certainty they know what's going to happen, is you shouldn't listen to them because this is a new virus, and even as we evolve through this pandemic, we're learning more information about it. You know, we expected, for example, things like the protests or the Lake of the Ozarks gathering that everybody's making a big deal about in Memorial Day weekend to, you know, result in these large number of cases, and they didn't. You know, and so what we're learning, for example, is that outdoor transmission may not be as you know, high a risk as an indoor transmission maybe. What we're also learning is that some people are not good at transmitting this disease, and others are super spreaders, and they can sort of, you know, lead to a huge number of cases, and we haven't figured out who sort of it falls into that category. The concern for the fall is twofold. One is that you already have in the fall the annual flu season, so hospitals are already overwhelmed. They're seeing hospitalizations result from influenza. And so if you continue to see these peaks, ebbs and flows, as you said, throughout the period of time, then you might have health systems getting more overwhelmed. The second is, you know, we know very little. We're starting to learn about co-infections between COVID-19 and other respiratory viruses. But the thought is, what if we know that if you survive COVID-19, you may still have some level of pulmonary issues for a period of time afterwards? This is a disease with immune action causes damage, direct lung injury. And so what does influenza look like in a COVID survivor? How do the two interact immunologically? You know, and all those data that we don't yet know could lead to worse outcomes for both flu patients and COVID patients. And so it is all of those things. I think it's, you know, the fact that we might continue getting new COVID cases because the season will be colder and we'll be more inside than we are outside. And then all the other things that I mentioned.
Perfect. So yeah, let's get back to the idea of kind of treatments, tests, vaccines. I mean, we keep hearing that we may have a vaccine available by early 2021. So that's unprecedented, right? So what will it take to actually reach that goal? And is this realistic? And maybe you could also talk a little bit about, how the life sciences industry and academic medical centers can work together, help expedite this timeline and ensure success for, at least a few of these vaccines.
Great. Why don't I start with the first part, the last part first. There's actually a lot of great collaboration across the city. You may have heard of the Mass Coalition for Pathogen Preparedness with the Broad and Harvard and BU and Needle are part of that, as are Tufts. What we represent is basically multiple cohorts of patients on their inpatient side, on their ambulatory side, and that scientific partnership, as well as the ability to set up these cohorts, has given us a lot of data about who these patients are, how they evolve naturally, what does immunity look like, and I think those kind of collaborations continuing and with the greater collaboration with industry, understanding what a effective immune response looks like in natural history would then sort of provide a great backdrop against which you could test vaccine efficacy as well. The thing that's, I think, we've moved at record speed. You'll heard others who talk about, I'm not in vaccine development, but those who are will tell you that we've moved in record speed, moving a lot of candidates to the clinical and preclinical spaces. A lot of the candidates, so you have the RNA viruses, RNA vaccines, the DNA vaccine, you have adenovirus, chimp adenovirus or vaccines from Oxford, a couple of other candidates sort of moving into phase 2-3 now. And the biggest delay with vaccine development is this period of time, which is the clinical testing. You need to sort of, if you see efficacy, in animal models, or if you see in sort of preclinical work, you go through the safety aspects, but the effectiveness, you need to let natural infections occur. You give patients either a vaccine or not, and then you observe them for a long period of time. And it is that naturally occurring infections and looking to see if there is protection that takes time, and that's also the period of time you don't want to rush, because you want to make sure that there's no potential adverse effects. Are you developing an immune response in response to the vaccine that's actually more harmful than helpful? And so that's the part that ethically can't really be hurried, and so that's why I think when you hear Dr. Fauci sort of talk about candidates, he says we might see some early signals because a couple of these vaccines already are in phase 2-3 by end of summer, beginning of fall. After that period of time, the big thing that needs to occur is once a candidate has been identified, it's mass producing and distributing, and there are many, I'm sure, in your audience who know a lot more about that than I do. But there has been some good work being done already in terms of anticipating what those pinch points in terms of supply chains, like medical glass, vials are, and sort of working on that. But it's, even if we get by winter, if we identified a candidate, mass production of that, and then distribution of it, and this is all as optimistic as you can be, I would still see that not everybody is going to get access to that vaccine until spring of 2021.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I just add that right now in Massachusetts alone, there's over 85 companies that are working on either testing, therapies, or vaccines. And that's truly amazing. And if you look at the 125 vaccines that are in development around the world, there's only 10 that are in clinical trials. And of the 10, one is from Massachusetts and the other is from a biopharma company with a huge presence in Massachusetts. So, I mean, I think the way folks are collaborating and sharing information, I think the bright spot out of all of this darkness for me is that I think that when this is done, what we've learned from collaboration and accelerating drug discovery or therapy discovery, vaccine discovery, whatever it is, we're going to be able to take this and translate it over to all unmet medical need, whether it's the cystic fibrosis, cancer, ALS, all of the things that we're working on, Alzheimer's, et cetera. So that's the good news. And I also think that the world is looking towards Massachusetts. We're undisputed, the best place in the world for science, innovation, and the life sciences. And the only thing that's going to get us out of this problem is science, innovation, and the life sciences. So let's keep doing it. Let's keep the dialogue happening. Let's keep the sharing happening, and we're going to get it done. And we will get through this because we don't have a choice. Right? It's the only way we get back to so-called normal is to beat this back. And I'm confident it will happen.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're all just waiting on Massachusetts and the rest of the world to come up with a vaccine. And in the meantime, you know, treatments, tests, contact tracing, we've talked about how important all of that is. And we do have a follow-up question from the audience around that, asking, Nahid, can you comment on the relative importance and applications of different types of COVID tests, PCR versus antigen versus antibody?
Yeah, I mean, I will probably take over the rest of the time if I do that. So I'll tell you what our experience has been. So in the clinical setting, what we found with a lot of the PCR tests is that you can actually get significant amount of false negatives. You know, with this virus, I think we know that you start shedding about 2.4 days before symptoms and continue an early part of your disease. And then over time, that viremia, the level of viral load sort of goes down, but then the virus also moves from the upper respiratory into lower respiratory over the period of time. So all this to say that the yield of PCR tests has been dependent on when someone appears. And so we've done either NPs or OPs, you know, dependent on when we think the patient's appearing. And we've had multiple cases where someone fits the definition of COVID through presentation, clearly has an exposure, but their first PCR test is negative. And so we've had to clinically come up with a protocol to do multiple tests, particularly in those who have high pretest probability. In general, false negatives are less of an issue with the PCR test. So antigen tests, the benefit of a lot of antigen tests has been, you know, many of these antigen tests drive the close to bedside, the point of care, you know, type of testing. And those have the advantage, particularly, you know, if they have high enough specificity and sensitivity to be able to be used in the emergency room to get an immediate answer. So, you know, generally, if you, a good example would be, you know, the H1N1 test that we actually had an antigen test of as well. If it's positive, it's great. If it's negative, you still have to potentially run a PCR test based on that. Antibody test is a whole other sort of kettle of fish that, you know, the CDC, the trouble with antibody tests, that we still think that the prevalence of the disease is pretty low, which means that there's a high risk of false positives, you know, and up to 50% false positives in low areas of sort of low prevalence. And so two aspects. One is if you have antibody test that's positive, question is this false positive or is it really true positive? And if it is true positive, are you immune or not? And I think, you know, all the caveats aside, if it's a true positive, you likely do have some level of immunity. If you recover from this disease, you have some level of immunity. I know you've seen the news story that's been floating around with like antibodies not being very high or dropping over a period of time. And those in the audience who've done, you know, do a lot more sort of bench work will tell you this as well. In infectious diseases, you know, you can see the titers of antibodies go down, but then if they're re-challenged, they can go up again. So it doesn't really tell you whether you're losing immunity over a period of time. So most other studies have shown you probably do have at least moderate 6 months to 8 months immunity to this disease after you have it. The antibody test, still not there for good enough for individual sort of advice, but good enough to make like answer population level questions. You know, is prevalence increasing over time without us realizing? You know, and so doing sort of population surveillance with the antibody test seems to still have a good enough role. I still wouldn't know. If I took an antibody test today, got positive, I still wouldn't be confident whether I'm immune or not because I wouldn't know if it's false positive.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like we have a lot of work to do still around tests and, you know, some time to go before we have a vaccine. So we'll need everyone collaborating on that. So let's flip to another topic. I mean, this is not the first pandemic that the world has endured. We talked a little bit about this before the town hall, but this one seems to really be wreaking havoc on human health and the economy. Can you help us understand, why this pandemic is so different than past ones? What we've learned from these past pandemics that are helping us address this one, and then, looking towards the future, how can we be better prepared for something like this in the future?
Yeah, if you happen to be in the Boston area, I actually give an entire class on this at the Fletcher School at Tufts. So it's actually just looking at pandemics, in recent history and how that's changed our perception. Just long story short, I think every pandemic has told us where some of the weaknesses in our international system are, let alone our national system. So SARS taught us that we need, SARS basically altered the way the whole world interacts. It led to revision of international health regulations and requirements that countries sort of share threats within their borders. It gave more powers to WHO to sort of declare this public health emergency of international concern. What Ebola taught us is, to be afraid of a disease like this. A high mortality, low transmission disease like Ebola could still have such an impact. And when we were recovering from that, for most of us, the question was, if we hit a disease like coronavirus, which is high transmission but low mortality, it can still debilitate healthcare systems because it can overwhelm your emergency rooms, right? You don't need a dangerous disease. You need a disease that's dangerous enough, where you'll have enough people requiring medical care that it will overwhelm the healthcare systems. And that's exactly what we've seen. The reason this is different is because the number, after Ebola, ASPR, the Assistant Secretary of Preparedness and Response, funded about 50 or so Ebola treatment centers across the country, put money into it to start this capacity at our hospitals to take care of highly communicable diseases. But most of those programs were to take care of a disease like Ebola. That's like 3 or 4 people at any one time, not hundreds of people coming into your emergency room. And the impact that a pandemic like this has is it impacts the health of everybody else in society. We saw 40-something% drop in strokes and heart attacks and all ER admissions across the country. We saw excess mortality, which cannot just be explained by COVID-19, which means people were dying at home and not coming to care. What we saw was a drop in vaccination. CDC vaccine tracking project looked at the drop in measles vaccine ordering systems, and that dropped in March during the worst months of this pandemic. And that's why this is different, is that, it's overwhelming the entire world at the same time. So it's applying the supply chains like I talked about, and the fact that it's having these secondary impacts. So I don't think we've had a handle on yet. It's when we move farther away from this pandemic, we're really going to truly recognize not just the economic tolls, which are going to be immense, or the psychological tolls, but the secondary health impacts of this.
Absolutely. Bob, we just have about 2 minutes. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I just think it's important that what the doctor was talking about, we learn from that. We can manufacture more things in the US and in Massachusetts. When you look at what people are doing now to make sure that we don't have a PPE shortage in the future, you look at the fact that in Massachusetts, we've always been good at making tricky stuff. We do have a pretty robust biomanufacturing workforce and book of business here in Massachusetts. Let's make it bigger. Let's start making the ingredients that go into these large molecule drugs and vaccines, et cetera. The API that we got, the approved pharmaceutical ingredients that go into the manufacturing here in Massachusetts, typically were made in other countries that were hit prior to us. So it was a big domino effect of what was happening that I just don't think any of us ever really thought could happen because we took so much for granted. So, let's change that just-in-time inventory mentality to a just-in-case inventory mentality so that we don't get hit with this again, because we know another virus can come along. We know that. The doctor is a professional and she's worked in this space as a world leader in this space for a long period of time. The rest of us typically thought, we heard about it, but this can't happen to us. We really thought that. So we can't think that way anymore. And, I can't thank Nahid, I can't thank you enough for all the work that you and your colleagues do, because when you think of what that surge looked like and how many people, and I mean, this has had a devastating impact on so many people have lost so many loved ones, and they're not all old folks either. I mean, I lost a friend that was 51 years old that didn't have underlying health conditions. And as the father of a child with cystic fibrosis, we have to take this so serious because this is different. And we can't thank you and all of your colleagues enough for the work that you do every day to see to it that we don't go through something like this again the way we did.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for having me, and thank you for the hard work everybody at MassBio is doing for this as well.
Thank you. We have a lot to be proud of. We really do.
That we do. And thank you, Nahid, again. Thank you, Bob, for your time. And thank you, audience, for joining us. Please join us next week. We have special guest Lisa Lacasse, president of the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, who's going to share insights around the critical work around cancer care and how we get back on track during COVID. Thank you again for joining, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.